Sarah Martinez had always known that working as a war correspondent would put her life at risk, but she never imagined it would lead her to the most terrifying 3 days of her existence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Afghan village as she adjusted her camera equipment and checked her notes one final time. Her editor back in New York had assigned her to cover a routine humanitarian mission in Kandahar province, documenting how American forces were helping local communities rebuild after years of conflict. The 28-year-old journalist from Texas had built her reputation covering dangerous stories in some of the world's most volatile regions. Her fearless approach to journalism had earned her respect among her colleagues, but it had also put her in harm's way more times than she cared to count. This assignment seemed different, though, almost peaceful compared to her previous work documenting battles in Syria and Iraq. Captain James Rodriguez, the commanding officer of the small outpost, had briefed her the night before about the mission. They would be visiting 3 villages to assess the progress of a school construction project funded by international aid. The convoy would consist of 4 vehicles carrying medical supplies, construction materials, and a small security detail. Sarah would travel in the second vehicle with Dr. Emily Chen, a volunteer medic who had been working in the region for 6 months. As dawn broke over the mountain ridges, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and unease. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, with golden wheat fields stretching toward snow-capped peaks in the distance. Local children had gathered near the convoy, their curious eyes following every movement as soldiers loaded the final supplies. She photographed their innocent faces, thinking how different their childhood was from her own safe upbringing in suburban Houston. The convoy began its journey at exactly 800 hours, following a route that had been deemed secure by intelligence reports. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her camera ready to capture images of the reconstruction efforts. The road wound through rocky terrain, past ancient olive groves and small farming communities where life seemed to continue despite decades of war. She interviewed Dr. Chen about her work, learning about the challenges of providing medical care in such remote areas. Everything seemed routine until they reached the halfway point of their journey. The lead vehicle suddenly stopped, and Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio with urgency she had never heard before. Intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting militant activity in the area ahead. The convoy faced a difficult decision: continue with the mission or turn back to base. After a tense discussion, they decided to proceed, believing their small size and humanitarian purpose would keep them safe. The attack came without warning as they navigated a narrow mountain pass. The first explosion shattered the morning silence, throwing dirt and rocks against their windshield. Sarah's heart raced as she realized they had driven straight into an ambush. The militants had chosen their position perfectly, with high ground on both sides of the road and no easy escape route. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple directions, the distinctive crack of AK-47s echoing off the canyon walls. Dr. Chen grabbed her medical bag instinctively as their driver. Sergeant Mike Thompson shouted for everyone to take cover. The vehicle lurched forward as Thompson tried to navigate through the kill zone, but another explosion disabled their engine. Steam poured from under the hood as they rolled to a stop, trapped between enemy positions with nowhere to run. Sarah's journalistic instincts kicked in even as terror gripped her chest. She began documenting the attack, knowing that if she survived, the world needed to see what happened here. Through her camera lens, she watched American soldiers display incredible courage under fire, returning shots while trying to protect the civilians in their convoy. The sound of gunfire was deafening, punctuated by shouted orders and the whistle of bullets passing overhead. Within minutes, it became clear that they were severely outnumbered. The militants had planned this attack carefully, using the terrain to their advantage while the convoy remained exposed on the open road. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions, suggesting they faced a well-coordinated enemy force. Captain Rodriguez made the difficult decision to call for immediate evacuation. Knowing their small security detail could not hold off such a large attack, the radio crackled with urgent communications as Rodriguez requested air support and a rescue operation. But help was hours away, and their ammunition was already running low. Sarah found herself thinking about her family back home, wondering if she would ever see them again. The woman who had fearlessly reported from war zones around the world was now experiencing combat from an entirely different perspective, no longer an observer, but a target fighting for survival. The intensity of the firefight escalated as more militants joined the ambush from concealed positions throughout the rocky landscape. Sarah pressed herself against the disabled vehicle's engine block, using it as cover while bullets sparked off the metal around her. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with diesel fuel from their damaged engine created a suffocating cloud that burned her throat and made her eyes water. Dr. Chen had immediately begun treating Sergeant Thompson, who had taken shrapnel in his shoulder when the second explosion rocked their position. Despite the chaos around them, the medic worked with steady hands, her training taking over even as enemy fire continued to rain down on their location. Sarah watched in amazement as the doctor remained calm under pressure, applying bandages while ducking between volleys of automatic weapons fire. Captain Rodriguez had established a defensive perimeter, using the 4 convoy vehicles as cover, but their position was becoming increasingly desperate. The militants controlled the high ground and had obviously planned this ambush for maximum effect. Every attempt to move toward better cover drew intense fire from multiple directions. Sarah could hear Rodriguez on the radio, his voice tight with stress as he coordinated with air support that was still 30 minutes away. The journalist found herself thinking like a soldier rather than a reporter, scanning for threats and looking for ways to help the overwhelmed security team. When she spotted movement on a ridge to their north, she quickly alerted Corporal Davis, who was manning a machine gun position behind the lead vehicle. Her warning allowed him to lay down suppressive fire that prevented the militants from flanking their position. As the minutes ticked by, their ammunition situation became critical. Sarah could see soldiers counting their remaining magazines, each one calculating how long they could continue to hold their position. The enemy fire seemed endless, suggesting the militants had prepared extensively for this attack with plenty of weapons and ammunition. She began to understand that this was not a random ambush, but a carefully planned operation targeting their humanitarian mission. The heat was becoming unbearable as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky. Sarah's water bottle was nearly empty, and she could see other members of the convoy rationing their supplies. Dr. Chen had used most of her medical supplies treating 3 wounded soldiers, and Sarah had given up her own water bottle to help clean their injuries. The combination of stress, heat, and dehydration was taking its toll on everyone. A lull in the firing allowed Captain Rodriguez to assess their situation more carefully. 2 vehicles were completely disabled. 1 soldier had serious injuries requiring immediate evacuation, and their defensive ammunition was down to less than an hour of sustained fighting. The captain made the difficult decision to attempt a breakout toward a small village they had passed earlier, hoping to find better defensive positions and potentially reach friendly forces. The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Sarah would travel with Dr. Chen and the wounded soldiers in the remaining functional vehicle, while the other soldiers would provide covering fire during their retreat. Rodriguez explained that they would move in stages, using natural cover to mask their withdrawal from the ambush site. The journalist felt her heart pounding as she realized their survival depended entirely on this desperate gamble. Just as they prepared to execute their escape plan, the sound of incoming mortar rounds whistled overhead. The militants had brought heavy weapons into the fight, dramatically escalating the danger for everyone trapped in the convoy. The first mortar exploded 50 meters short of their position, showering them with rocks and dirt. Sarah instinctively covered her head as debris rained down around them. The mortar attack changed everything about their tactical situation. Their vehicles provided no protection against indirect fire, and staying in place now meant certain death. Rodriguez immediately ordered the breakout to begin, knowing they had only minutes before the enemy gunners found their range. Sarah grabbed her camera equipment and prepared to run for her life across open ground, under heavy fire. Dr. Chen helped load the wounded soldiers into the remaining vehicle while Sarah and 2 soldiers provided covering fire from their current positions. The journalist had never fired a weapon in combat before, but desperation and training from her embedded assignments took over. She aimed at muzzle flashes on the ridgeline, not knowing if her shots were effective, but hoping to keep enemy heads down during the evacuation. The breakout began with a coordinated burst of automatic weapons fire from the remaining soldiers. Their vehicle lurched forward as the driver floored the accelerator, tires spinning in the loose gravel as they raced toward a rocky outcropping that might provide cover. Sarah ran alongside the vehicle, her lungs burning from the thin mountain air and physical exertion. Enemy fire pursued them across the open ground, bullets kicking up dust clouds around their feet as they sprinted toward uncertain safety. Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of another mortar round incoming, and threw herself behind a boulder, just as the explosion erupted 20 meters behind them. The shockwave knocked the wind from her lungs and filled her ears with ringing that would last for hours. When she looked back toward their original position, Sarah saw that the abandoned vehicles were now burning wreckage. The militants had scored direct hits with their mortars, destroying any hope of returning for equipment or supplies they had left behind. The small group of survivors was now completely on their own, cut off from their base and surrounded by hostile forces in some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. The rocky outcropping provided temporary shelter, but Sarah could see that their situation was deteriorating rapidly. The militants had not given up their pursuit and were systematically searching the area, using coordinated teams to flush out the survivors. Captain Rodriguez gathered his remaining personnel behind a large boulder and quickly assessed their resources. 3 soldiers were wounded. They had less than 200 rounds of ammunition remaining, and their only vehicle had taken multiple hits during the escape. Dr. Chen worked frantically to stabilize Sergeant Thompson, whose shoulder wound had reopened during their desperate run across open ground. The medic had almost exhausted her medical supplies, using torn fabric from her own uniform to create additional bandages. Sarah found herself serving as an impromptu medical assistant, helping to apply pressure to wounds while scanning the horizon for enemy movement through her camera's telephoto lens. The journalist's equipment had proven unexpectedly useful during their fight for survival. Her telephoto lens allowed her to spot enemy positions at distances the soldiers could not see with their naked eyes, while her knowledge of the terrain from studying maps before the mission helped Rodriguez plan their next moves. She had transformed from passive observer to active participant in their struggle to stay alive. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. The temperature soared above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and their water supplies were critically low. Sarah watched soldiers share single sips from their remaining bottles, rationing every drop while maintaining watch for enemy activity. The combination of stress, heat exhaustion, and dehydration was pushing everyone to their physical limits. Rodriguez received intermittent radio contact with their base, but the mountainous terrain interfered with communications. Air support was still inbound, but had been delayed by weather conditions over the mountains. The captain estimated they would need to hold their position for at least another 4 hours before rescue could arrive. Sarah could see the worry in his eyes as he calculated their odds of surviving that long with their current resources. The militants launched their next assault just after 1400 hours, using small teams to probe their defenses from multiple directions. Sarah found herself firing her borrowed rifle at targets she could barely see, relying on muzzle flashes and movement to guide her shots. The constant stress of combat was exhausting, requiring intense concentration while knowing that any mistake could be fatal for the entire group. During a brief lull in the fighting, Dr. Chen pulled Sarah aside and quietly explained that Sergeant Thompson needed immediate surgical attention to survive. His wounds were beyond what she could treat in the field, and infection was already setting in due to the desert conditions. The medic asked Sarah to document Thompson's condition, knowing that if they did not all survive, someone needed to tell his story to his family back home. The request struck Sarah deeply as she realized the true weight of her responsibility as a journalist. She was not just recording events for her newspaper, but potentially creating the final record of brave people who had given their lives trying to help others. Through her camera lens, she captured images of soldiers sharing their last water with wounded comrades and Dr. Chen, working to save lives despite impossible conditions. As evening approached, their tactical situation became even more dire. The militants had brought in reinforcements and were clearly planning a major assault under cover of darkness. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to attempt another movement, hoping to reach a small village where they might find better defensive positions or contact friendly forces. The alternative was to remain in place and face overwhelming odds when the enemy attacked. The plan required them to move through a narrow canyon that offered concealment, but also created the perfect location for another ambush. Sarah helped load the wounded soldiers onto improvised stretchers made from rifle straps and torn uniforms. Every piece of equipment had to be carefully prioritized, as they could only carry essential items during their movement through dangerous terrain. Just before they prepared to move out, Sarah's camera captured something that would later become one of the most powerful images of the conflict. Corporal Davis, barely 20 years old and wounded in the leg, was carefully cleaning his rifle while sharing his last piece of chocolate with Dr. Chen. The image showed the humanity that persisted even in the midst of their desperate fight for survival. The movement through the canyon began at dusk, with 2 soldiers providing security ahead, while the others carried the wounded and remaining supplies. Sarah moved with the main group, helping to support Thompson's stretcher while maintaining watch for enemy activity. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, creating an eerie echo that amplified every sound and made it impossible to determine the direction of potential threats. Halfway through the canyon, they encountered evidence of recent militant activity, fresh footprints in the sand and abandoned equipment that suggested enemy forces had used this route recently. Rodriguez made the decision to continue forward, knowing that turning back would mean certain capture or death. Sarah felt her heart pounding as they navigated through the narrow passage, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy fighter. The canyon opened into a small valley where they could see the village Rodriguez had targeted for their new defensive position. However, as they approached the settlement, it became clear that the militants had anticipated their movement. Smoke rose from several buildings, and there were no signs of civilian activity. The village had either been evacuated or attacked, eliminating their hope of finding friendly shelter. With darkness falling and their options rapidly disappearing, the small group of survivors faced their most critical decision. They could attempt to defend the abandoned village, continue moving through unknown terrain in darkness, or try to find a hiding place and wait for rescue that might never come. Sarah realized that whatever choice they made in the next few minutes would determine whether any of them lived to see another sunrise. Captain Rodriguez made the agonizing decision to take shelter in a partially collapsed building on the outskirts of the abandoned village. The structure had thick stone walls that would provide some protection from enemy fire, and its location offered multiple escape routes if they were discovered. Sarah helped establish their makeshift defensive position while Dr. Chen continued treating the wounded soldiers by the light of a small flashlight covered with red cloth to avoid detection. The temperature dropped dramatically as night fell in the Afghan mountains, creating another challenge for the injured survivors. Sarah gave up her jacket to help keep Sergeant Thompson warm, while the other soldiers shared their remaining gear to prevent hypothermia from setting in. The combination of blood loss, dehydration, and cold weather was pushing the wounded men toward shock, making Dr. Chen's job even more difficult. Throughout the long night, Sarah took turns standing watch with the remaining soldiers, scanning the darkness for any sign of enemy movement. The silence was more terrifying than the earlier gunfire had been, as every small sound could indicate approaching militants. Her ears still rang from the explosions, making it difficult to distinguish between real threats and imagined dangers in the oppressive darkness. Around midnight, they heard vehicles approaching from the direction they had come. Rodriguez immediately ordered everyone to maintain absolute silence, while 2 soldiers moved to observation positions near the windows. Through her camera's night vision capability, Sarah could see at least 3 trucks filled with armed militants systematically searching the area. The enemy was conducting a thorough sweep, checking every building and potential hiding place. The militants came terrifyingly close to discovering their position, searching the building next to theirs with flashlights and loud voices. Sarah held her breath as footsteps passed just meters from their hiding place, knowing that a single cough or movement could give away their location. Dr. Chen kept her hand pressed over Thompson's mouth, as the wounded soldier was becoming delirious from fever and might cry out inadvertently. After what felt like hours, the search party moved on toward the next cluster of buildings. However, Sarah noticed that they had left at least 1 man behind as a sentry, positioned where he could watch several potential hiding places, including their building. Any attempt to move or signal for help would likely be spotted immediately, trapping them in their shelter until the militants decided to conduct a more thorough search. The psychological strain of remaining hidden while surrounded by enemy forces pushed everyone to their breaking points. Sarah found herself thinking about her childhood in Texas, remembering summer evenings when her biggest worry was finishing homework before bedtime. The contrast between those innocent memories and her current situation felt surreal, like she was living in someone else's nightmare. As dawn approached, their water supplies were completely exhausted, and Sergeant Thompson's condition had worsened significantly. His fever was spiking, and Dr. Chen quietly told Rodriguez that without proper medical treatment within hours they would lose him. The captain faced an impossible choice: risk everyone's lives attempting to reach help, or watch a good soldier die while they remained hidden. Sarah volunteered for a desperate mission that might save Thompson's life and alert rescue forces to their location. Using her press credentials and knowledge of local dialects learned during previous assignments, she would attempt to reach the next village and find either medical help or a way to communicate with American forces. Rodriguez initially refused, but Sarah argued that as a civilian, she might have a better chance of moving undetected through enemy-controlled territory. The plan required her to leave during the pre-dawn darkness, when militant sentries might be less alert, but visibility was still poor enough to provide concealment. Sarah would carry her camera equipment and press identification, hoping that if captured, her status as a journalist might provide some protection. She knew the risks were enormous, but doing nothing meant watching people die who had risked their lives to protect her. Dr. Chen gave Sarah the last remaining antibiotics from her medical kit, along with detailed instructions for treating Thompson's wound if she found help. The medic also provided her with a coded message to transmit if she reached friendly forces, containing their exact location and the number of casualties requiring immediate evacuation. Sarah memorized every detail, knowing that any mistake could doom the entire group. Before leaving, she took a final photograph of the soldiers maintaining their desperate vigil in the ruined building. The image captured exhausted faces illuminated by the faint light of dawn, showing both the determination and vulnerability of people pushed beyond their limits by circumstances beyond their control. Sarah tucked the camera's memory card inside her boot, ensuring that their story would survive even if she did not. Rodriguez shook her hand solemnly before she slipped out through a hole in the building's rear wall. The captain told her that if she did not return within 6 hours, they would assume she had been captured or killed and would attempt their own breakout. Sarah nodded, understanding that she was now completely on her own in hostile territory with no backup plan if things went wrong. The journey through the village required moving from shadow to shadow, carefully avoiding the sentry positions she had observed during the night. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the enemy guards would hear it, but her experience covering conflicts in urban environments had taught her how to move quietly through dangerous areas. Each step took her further from the relative safety of her companions and deeper into unknown dangers. As she reached the village outskirts, Sarah could see the first hints of sunrise coloring the eastern mountains. She had perhaps 2 hours of semi-darkness remaining before full daylight would make movement nearly impossible. The next village was at least 3 miles away across open terrain, and she had no way of knowing whether it was controlled by friendly forces or more militants who would kill her on sight. Sarah's solitary journey across the barren landscape became a test of endurance unlike anything she had experienced in her career as a war correspondent. Without water and exhausted from 2 days of combat stress, she forced herself to maintain a steady pace while constantly scanning for enemy patrols or potential shelter. The rocky terrain provided some concealment, but every ridge and valley could hide militants who would show no mercy to an American journalist traveling alone. The sun climbed higher as she navigated toward the distant village, using landmarks she had memorized from military maps during the convoy's original mission briefing. Sarah's mouth felt like cotton, and her legs trembled from dehydration and exhaustion, but the thought of Sergeant Thompson dying while his comrades waited for help drove her forward. She had become more than an observer of the story. She was now an active participant fighting to save lives. After 2 hours of difficult travel, she reached a vantage point overlooking the target village and discovered a scene that filled her with both hope and terror. The settlement showed signs of recent fighting, with damaged buildings and abandoned vehicles scattered throughout the streets. However, she could also see smoke rising from cooking fires and people moving cautiously between the structures, suggesting the village was still inhabited. Using her camera's telephoto lens, Sarah carefully studied the activity below to determine whether the village was controlled by friendly forces or enemy militants. The people she observed appeared to be ordinary civilians going about their daily routines rather than armed fighters. But she had learned during her years covering conflicts that appearances could be deceiving in war zones. Her Situation became more dangerous when she spotted a military patrol approaching the village from the south. Through her lens, she could see that the soldiers were carrying AK-47 rifles and wearing the distinctive clothing of the militant groups that had attacked their convoy. Sarah realized she was trapped between the patrol and the village, with no clear escape route that would not expose her to observation from multiple directions. The decision to continue toward the village despite the approaching patrol required every ounce of courage Sarah possessed. She had come too far to turn back, and Thompson's life depended on her finding help within the next few hours. Moving carefully from rock to rock, she descended toward the village while keeping the patrol under observation through her camera's display screen. Her approach to the village coincided with the patrol's arrival from the opposite direction, creating a chaotic situation that actually worked in Sarah's favor. The inhabitants were distracted by the armed men demanding information about American soldiers, allowing her to slip into the settlement unnoticed. She found shelter behind a stone wall and listened to the heated conversation between the militants and villagers. From her hiding place, Sarah realized that the patrol was searching for her group specifically, offering rewards for information about their location, while threatening violence against anyone who helped American forces. The villagers claimed no knowledge of any soldiers in the area, but Sarah could see fear in their faces as they denied assisting coalition forces. After the patrol moved on, Sarah waited nearly an hour before revealing herself to an elderly man who was tending goats behind the same wall where she was hiding. The man's initial shock gave way to concern when he saw her condition, and despite the language barrier, he seemed to understand that she needed help. Sarah showed him her press credentials and tried to communicate that there were wounded soldiers who required medical attention. The old man led her to a small house where his daughter, who spoke limited English, helped translate Sarah's urgent requests. The family had no radio or telephone, but they knew of another village several hours away where Afghan National Army forces maintained a small outpost. The daughter, named Fatima, volunteered to guide Sarah to the outpost despite the obvious dangers involved. Fatima's decision to help represented incredible courage, as assisting American forces could result in deadly retaliation from militants operating in the area. The young Afghan woman explained that her brother had been killed fighting alongside coalition troops, and she felt obligated to honor his memory by helping Sarah. This act of bravery from someone who had already sacrificed so much for the war effort moved Sarah to tears. The journey to the Afghan National Army outpost required crossing an open valley where they would be completely exposed to observation from the surrounding hills. Fatima led Sarah along paths known only to local villagers, using ancient irrigation ditches and rocky outcroppings to provide concealment during their dangerous trek. The two women moved in silence, communicating only through hand signals as they navigated through potential kill zones. Halfway to their destination, they encountered another challenge that nearly ended their mission. A group of armed men on motorcycles appeared on a ridge overlooking their route, scanning the valley with binoculars and automatic weapons. Sarah and Fatima pressed themselves against a stone wall, hoping the shadows would conceal them from the searching eyes above their position. The militants spent nearly 30 minutes examining the valley before moving on to search other areas. During those terrifying moments, Sarah found herself thinking about the soldiers waiting for help in the abandoned village, knowing that every delay reduced Thompson's chances of survival. The weight of responsibility for their lives pressed down on her as heavily as the Afghan sun beating on her back. When they finally reached the outpost, Sarah's appearance shocked the Afghan soldiers, who had not expected to encounter an American journalist traveling alone through hostile territory. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Ahmadi, listened intently as Fatima translated Sarah's urgent requests for medical evacuation and military support. Sarah provided precise coordinates for her companion's location and detailed information about the enemy forces in the area. Lieutenant Ahmadi immediately contacted Coalition headquarters while his medic treated Sarah for severe dehydration and exhaustion. Within minutes, she could hear helicopters being dispatched for the rescue mission, but the flight time to reach her trapped companions would be at least 40 minutes. Sarah realized that her desperate gamble had succeeded, but whether she had acted quickly enough to save Thompson's life remained uncertain. As rescue helicopters lifted off from distant bases, Sarah collapsed from exhaustion and relief. knowing that she had done everything possible to save the soldiers who had protected her during their shared ordeal. The young woman from Texas who had begun this assignment as a routine documentation of humanitarian work had been transformed into someone who understood the true cost of war and the bonds forged between people who faced death together. The sound of approaching helicopters created a mixture of hope and anxiety at both the Afghan National Army outpost and the abandoned village where Captain Rodriguez maintained his desperate vigil with the wounded soldiers. Sarah had been unconscious for 20 minutes when the distinctive rotor noise of American Blackhawks echoed across the valley, signaling that her mission had succeeded in alerting rescue forces to their location. Lieutenant Ahmadi's radio crackled with updates from the incoming helicopters as Sarah regained consciousness. The rescue team consisted of 2 Blackhawks carrying Navy SEALs and medical personnel, supported by Apache attack helicopters that would provide cover during the evacuation operation. Sarah struggled to sit up, insisting that she needed to guide the rescuers to her companions despite her obvious exhaustion. The SEAL team leader, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, landed at the outpost first to coordinate the rescue operation with Sarah and Lieutenant Ahmadi. When Sarah learned that the SEAL shared the same last name as the wounded sergeant they were racing to save, she took it as a positive sign that their ordeal might finally be ending. Chief Thompson studied her hand-drawn map and listened carefully to her description of enemy positions around the target village. Meanwhile, at the abandoned building where Rodriguez and his soldiers waited, the approaching helicopters created both relief and terror. While rescue was finally at hand, the incoming aircraft would also attract every militant in the area to their exact location. Dr. Chen continued working on Thompson, who had slipped in and out of consciousness throughout the morning hours. His fever had broken, but infection was spreading through his system at an alarming rate. The SEAL rescue operation unfolded with precision that Sarah found almost surreal after the chaos of the previous 2 days. Apache helicopters swept the area around the village, identifying and engaging enemy positions, while the Blackhawks approached from multiple directions to confuse any militants who might attempt to shoot them down. Sarah watched through binoculars from the outpost as the professionally executed operation demonstrated the capabilities she had only read about in military reports. Chief Thompson's team fast-roped into the abandoned village and immediately established a defensive perimeter around Rodriguez's position. Within minutes, they had located the survivors and begun loading the wounded soldiers onto stretchers for evacuation. Sarah felt overwhelming relief as she watched through her telephoto lens, knowing that her desperate journey had saved lives. The extraction required 2 helicopter trips due to the number of wounded personnel and the need to maintain adequate security during the loading process. Sergeant Thompson was among the first soldiers evacuated, with Dr. Chen accompanying him to provide continued medical care during the flight to the field hospital. Sarah documented the rescue operation through her camera, capturing images of the professional medical team that took over Thompson's treatment. When the second helicopter arrived to collect the remaining survivors, Sarah insisted on flying with them, despite offers to evacuate her separately. Captain Rodriguez, who had maintained command of his soldiers throughout their 3-day ordeal, shook her hand with obvious emotion as they lifted off from the village that had nearly become their tomb. The journalist had proven herself to be far more than an observer. During their shared trial by fire, the flight to the medical facility provided Sarah's first opportunity to process what had happened during their survival ordeal. Looking down at the harsh Afghan landscape, she realized how close they had all come to dying in those mountains. The story she had expected to write about humanitarian reconstruction had become a personal account of courage, sacrifice, and survival that would change her perspective on war forever. At the field hospital, Sarah learned that her photographs and video footage from the ambush had captured evidence of war crimes committed by the militants who attacked their humanitarian convoy. Her documentation would later be used in international criminal proceedings, giving legal weight to the suffering she had witnessed and endured. The journalist's commitment to recording events even under fire had created a permanent record of both enemy atrocities and American heroism. Sergeant Thompson underwent emergency surgery that saved his life, with doctors crediting Sarah's mission to find help as the decisive factor in his survival. Dr. Chen had managed to prevent infection from becoming fatal, but without the antibiotics and IV fluids provided by the rescue medical team, Thompson would not have lasted another day. The young soldier would recover fully and return to duty 6 months later. During her medical evaluation, Sarah discovered that she had lost 15 pounds during the 3-day ordeal and was suffering from severe dehydration, exhaustion, and early signs of post-traumatic stress. However, the physical wounds healed much more quickly than the emotional impact of watching good people risk their lives to protect others. She would spend months processing the psychological aftermath of her experience. The story Sarah eventually wrote about their survival became one of the most powerful pieces of war correspondence published that year. Her first-hand account of military courage and civilian heroism resonated with readers around the world, while her photographs provided visual evidence of both the brutality of war and the bonds that form between people who face death together. The article earned her numerous journalism awards and recognition as one of the best war correspondents of her generation. More importantly, Sarah's experience changed her understanding of the human cost of conflict and the courage required of both military personnel and civilians caught in war zones. She had begun the assignment as an observer, documenting other people's work. But circumstances had transformed her into an active participant, whose decisions and actions had direct life and death consequences. The young woman from Texas had discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. Years later, Sarah would maintain contact with the soldiers who had protected her during those terrifying days in Afghanistan. Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Chen, and Sergeant Thompson became lifelong friends who shared a bond forged in the crucible of combat. Their annual reunions served as reminders of how ordinary people can display extraordinary courage when circumstances demand heroic actions, and how survival sometimes depends on the willingness of strangers to risk everything to help others in desperate need.